Yeah.
And we are live.
Hello there.
Hello.
Hello. Let me see.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you, and we are live. Okay. Now we're gonna wait a few seconds to see people joining in. Okay. I'm gonna type here if you have.
Yeah. You can maybe also say it at the beginning, Tommy.
People are tuning in. Hello, everybody. We're gonna wait a few seconds to allow people to get in, and then we will start. I guess that around 20 participants we can start.
How many do we have?
15.
Okay, so 5 more.
5 more, otherwise we can start. Yeah. And then people will tune in. Okay, so I guess we can start now. I'd like to welcome everybody for the first Coukl Dialogue. A special thank you to Stefan Dömpke, who is here with us, and Elisa will present him later. So as you guys know, during this COVID times, we are tested with these new technological capacities, and we can't meet physically anymore. So we decided to bring Coukl to you, to your houses. The first cycle of events will have as a theme biodiversity, which is a theme that is getting momentum in international arena. There's different strategies being published, and by the EU at the global level. And therefore, we would like to analyze this topic of biodiversity, which is the variety of life forms. It can be summarized like that. But since we are Coukl and we don't like superficial things, we would like to go in depth with each topic. And so today, for this perspective, we're looking at the linkages between biodiversity and the World Heritage Convention. Before we start, and I give the word to Elisa, just a few housekeeping rules. Let's say if you have any questions, please type them in the comment box below, and I will collect them during the interview and then ask them to our guest at the end of the lecture. And yeah, at the end of the webinar, we will say what's our next guest, who is our next guest. But for now, Elisa, take it away.
Yeah, so thank you, Tommy, for the introduction, and thank you, Stefan, for being here, for accepting our invitation, most of all. And I'd like to introduce you very briefly to our listeners. So you are the head of World Heritage Watch, which is an NGO based in Berlin. Concerning your career, you've always been active in the struggle for nature conservation and for the rights of indigenous people. You joined the international anti-nuclear movement, and this brought you to deal with UNESCO biosphere reserves and World Heritage sites. And it's during your consultancy missions that you realize how UNESCO sometimes makes decisions based on insufficient or incorrect information, and that it's local people or NGOs, people who really work on spot, that can provide complete and updated information. And that's this awareness that led you to the founding of World Heritage Watch in 2014. The NGO is basically a network of other NGOs, of local groups, of activist movements, and also individual experts. And you gather every year before the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO. You discuss issues going on in World Heritage sites. You collect them, publish a report, which is brought to the attention of UNESCO and the advisory bodies. At the committee, basically. So you're now recognized as the voice of civil society, and your activity is really, really interesting. So we're very thankful to have you here today. And if everyone can hear each other, I would say I could start asking you first question, which is if you could provide us with some background concerning the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, its content, principles, let's say, and how it relates to biodiversity. Why does it interest us today to talk about these two topics?
Okay, thank you, Elisa. Thank you for having me. Yesterday, I read again through a little booklet about how the World Heritage Convention came about. And it's very, very interesting because at the beginning of it was actually nature conservation. We have well, every time I talk about UNESCO, I never fail to say that UNESCO was the direct result of World War II. And it's expressed in the motto of UNESCO that wars are started in the minds of man and the defenses of peace must be built in the minds of men. So it's about education and culture. But that's it. UNESCO was founded less than 1 year after the end of World War II. So it's a direct outcome of the experience of the unprecedented destruction, especially of cultural heritage in the war. But the first Director General of UNESCO was Julian Huxley, a biologist, famous from a famous family. And his brother was Aldous Huxley, the famous author of Brave New World. And it was Julian Huxley who in 1948 also initiated the founding of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is one of the advisory bodies of UNESCO. And then in 1961, the founding of the World Wildlife Fund. That time was called World Wildlife Fund. So even in UNESCO, the first important people were connected to nature conservation. But the convention, while UNESCO had a task, of course, to do something about the preservation or conservation of cultural heritage. But as these big organizations work, they work slowly. And the decisive input came from the United States, more specifically from the White House, from the presidency, who organized in 1965 the White House Conference on Natural Beauty. Imagine. The White House organized a conference on natural beauty. Compare with today. Then you know it. On that conference, it was suggested to create a World Heritage Trust. Something that would, of course, take care and support the conservation of natural and cultural heritage. Because in the United States, is maybe the only country where both of them are under one agency, the National Park Service. So they never made that distinction. And then 2 years later, a delegate of the US government suggested the same thing on an IUCN conference. So IUCN started working to draft a paper that could be introduced to the international community. And all this happened without the knowledge even of UNESCO. Then Sweden suggested to organize in 1972 an international conference of human habitat, which later became the famous Stockholm Environment Conference. And the Swedish wanted results. They wanted international conventions to be adopted on that conference, as to have some success, some output of the conference. So then, United States government, later, by the way, from 1970, I think, from 71, under President Richard Nixon, who was supporting this whole thing. He also created the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. So the US was always behind this. They worked with IUCN, and only when the Swedish brought the issue into the international UN context, then UNESCO eventually, let's say, woke up. And it was the director of the Division for Natural Sciences, Michel Baptiste, French, who in '68 had organized the Biosphere Conference, from which the Man and the Biosphere Reserve program originated, that Baptiste realized what was going on and the potential that was in it. And then he eventually convinced that time Director General of UNESCO, René Maheu, who then connected with Maurice Tron, who was the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference. And then it was a long diplomatic struggle to bring this IUCN draft and UNESCO's task for cultural heritage together into one document. And the solution was that then the Stockholm Conference adopted a decision recommending the adoption of the World Heritage Convention on the UNESCO General Assembly or General Conference in November 1972. So you see two things. In these years, in the 1960s, early 70s, there was just one world power, that was the United States. And it, fortunately, Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency gave some attention to nature conservation. IUCN worked with it, and then it was through the power of the United States who brought the Swedish UNESCO and IUCN together, gave, of course, a lot of money, made sure that the convention was adopted in 1972. So you see, biodiversity protection was one of the, let's say, founding ideas of the convention, whereas UNESCO was more or less a bit overwhelmed about the whole idea. So that I think is a very fascinating story. The more you read about it, the more fascinating aspects it has. And then, of course, now, after almost 50 years, we have 10 criteria in the convention under which any nomination can be inscribed. And 4 of them relate to nature. criteria 7 to 10. 7 is, very briefly, I don't want to quote here, areas of exceptional natural beauty. You still have the idea of beauty in the convention, originating from the White House Conference in '65. Then outstanding examples of geological phenomena. That is criteria 8. Criteria 9 is about ecological and biological evolutionary processes. That's Galapagos, etc. And then 10 specifically addresses biological diversity. So you have a whole range of everything you can think of in terms of nature is covered in the convention. And of course,
yeah.
It's IUCN's policy to select only one example of each type of ecosystem for the convention. They select only the one best example for this. So most of the types of ecosystems are covered, but there are still considerable gaps that need to be filled, and UNESCO is encouraging the state parties to nominate sites which can fill these gaps. These are both marine, we have big gaps in marine protected areas. We also have deserts and semi-deserts. Not too much is covered. So this is the policy. But once you have a certain type of ecosystem covered, and it's covered, and UNESCO will not recommend the inscription of more sites at the same time. This is very different from the cultures.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how the leaders of yesterday and of today have this current conception about natural beauty. Yesterday, the New York Times released an article that the current administration has been rolling back 100 pieces of legislation, of environmental legislation. So you see the difference there.
Yeah.
Yeah, waiting for the combination just under this one criteria. That's something I really would like to see. Most nominations come under 2 or 3 different criteria. I would like to see one only on this criteria, and then see what happens.
Yeah.
Because we need to discuss.
Stefan, you have to speak out loud. Sorry, we cannot really hear you.
Yeah, we need to have a discussion on beauty in UNESCO. That would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, it's really like interesting to see how also the development of the convention is linked to the history or the development of the international agenda in post-war times, which is not like that's evident when we see World Heritage sites labeled and as tourists who are going there, but we are not aware of what it's all about. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. And it's actually a good link with my second question. If you don't have anything else to add, Stefan, concerning this introductory note, let's say. Well, I know you have plenty of things you could tell us, but yeah. Well, I'd like you to tell us something more specifically concerning biodiversity and what's actually the state of the art, let's say, of World Heritage sites in these terms. And if you can mention maybe 3 issues affecting sites in terms of biodiversity and what can be done, what is done within the framework of the convention to deal with that, and yeah, how it is possible, what the issues are.
Okay. I think I should mention first that the World Heritage Convention is protecting specific sites. You have other conventions like Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on Migrating Species, Convention on trade of endangered species, etc. So there are numerous other conventions protecting biodiversity. This one is to protect the most valuable ones, those without whom you cannot, let's say, save or safeguard biodiversity, because they have most of the animals of certain species in these areas. So what the convention does is to add an additional layer of protection to the protection that is in place on the basis of national law. This is an international convention, international legal instrument, which adds to what is already there. And then we immediately have to mention the issue of international conventions, because UNESCO has no executive power, and no other UN body has any executive power in any given country, with the one exception of the Security Council for a very limited number of issues like war and peace. That means UNESCO can urge countries to do something, but they cannot intervene. The value of the convention is a very tight monitoring system. It's not tight enough, I would say, because many problems escape the attention of the World Heritage Committee. That's why we are there. But it is much, much better than anything else. The periodic reporting that each country has to do, the reactive monitoring missions. There's a huge system in place for these 1,000 sites or 213 natural sites that observe, that monitor the state of conservation of these sites. Plus, then, of course, once a site is enlisted, it's so much easier to raise funds for the safeguarding of the site, because this now has nimbus of being one of the 1,121 most important sites in the world. So if you don't want to protect this, then what do you want to protect? That is, I think, a very important idea, that the international community agrees that these are the most important sites. That's why they're on the list. And there is, of course, the very elaborate system of evaluating the nomination. The nomination itself, now nominations have usually around 1,000 pages document. So a huge amount of work has to go into the nomination. There is a field evaluation, there are desk evaluation, there's all kinds of intelligence that goes into the evaluation, and then there is the monitoring system. So this is special, and this is different from the other convention. But in the end, if the national governments decides to destroy their World Heritage Site, in the end, there's very little the international community can do. That's a very unfortunate fact. Again, we could go back to the history that I just described, when there was also an idea to create just a program, like the Worldwide Fund for Nature, that just puts money, puts activities to safeguard certain sites. Then you don't have to deal with all this diplomacy, the UN bureaucracy and everything else. That is something in light of what we are seeing now, that more and more countries decide simply to ignore UNESCO. So we have our own priorities, that's what we do. And, So that's becoming a problem. But still, the World Heritage List, this whole procedure with the name of UNESCO behind it, has a very, very strong impact. Plus, there is an idea, I think, that is extremely important and valuable. The idea that this is world heritage. This is your and your and your and my heritage. So all of us can claim that these sites will be safeguarded for us. When I go to another country, I can say, please keep this for me. When they come to Germany, they can talk to decision makers of Germany and say, please safeguard this for us. So this is in a way a nucleus of a kind of world civilization. This is the common stock of the world in terms of heritage. And our governments, no matter who they are, they have agreed that this is the common stock. There's no way around it. I think this is an idea that really is at the base of multilateralism, and that is an idea that allows for all of us to be involved. This is the reason why World Heritage Watch demands to have a voice in the name of civil society of all people of the world. This is our heritage. It's my heritage. I want to speak up for it. That we have to realize that the World Heritage Convention is site-specific. This is a big advantage too, because of course a lot of lessons are learned from the activities. And the other conventions, which are more thematical or structural, have to make a much bigger effort to have tangible results, because all these things have to go through national law. When Convention on Migrating Species is adopted, 193 countries have to ratify it, they have to implement it. In the World Heritage Convention, once a site is on the list, it's on the list, and then it's protected. Okay. The big problems that we have, of course, climate change is now the biggest. And I don't want to talk about climate change because everybody knows climate change, and that is a problem for everything. No, it's not specific for the World Heritage or anything. It affects everything. The documentation about how it affects World Heritage sites is amassing, and we see that really it affects more or less all the sites in one way or the other. But the specific threats to natural World Heritage, I would say, is of course poaching, still, not in all sites, but in those sites with the iconic biodiversity, poaching is the major threat. And of course, the demand is outside the areas, the sites, the markets is outside, so the threat is coming from outside. We all know where the markets are, essentially in East Asia and Southeast Asia. The second one I would like to mention is, of course, loss of habitat. We have to realize that, of course, the protected areas, the World Heritage sites, don't cover all the habitats of all the species. And outside the protected areas, these species are losing more and more of their habitat. And it comes down, we cannot protect species only on the basis of protected areas. We have come to realize that we have to do more, but without the protected areas, there's no hope we can do anything. So we have to fight the loss of habitat. And the third is coming more and more to our attention, especially through our last report, that we have seen that tourism development is becoming a major threat. Not only in historic cities like Venice or sites like Machu Picchu, but also inside Natural World Heritage sites for hotels, for adventure tourism, mountaineering, all these types of, say, action or activity tourism. It is taking on the dimension that is becoming, in some or more and more cases, becoming too big to handle. And even more remote places or smaller places are affected by tourism development. It permeates actually into more or less all the places. I think the type of tourism we had through influencers, through the internet, where people post on the social media, I'm here and it's fantastic and come to see it. That very minute, thousands of people see that and they're making plans. Now I want to be there too, because this is of course, this is a fantastic place. And, let's go there. So all the young people are ready to go, and it's a big adventure, but they're doing a lot of damage. And then, of course, the hotels and the guest houses and the tour operators and everything comes in. And then that's when we see the damage. I hope that the COVID-19 pandemic has already, of course, brought things to a halt. And we should use this moment that we have to rethink. And I was very surprised to see that UNESCO doesn't have a tourism policy, and UNESCO has no standards, no criteria relating to tourism for the inscription of sites in the World Heritage List. I think each site that wants to be inscribed needs a tourism plan, needs to tell UNESCO how they want to handle tourism once it's inscribed. Because tourism goes up like this. Once it's inscribed, you have to do nothing. It goes up like this. The Asians, when they come to Europe, they go nowhere else. They say, World Heritage, that's the best, and that's what we want to see. So don't worry, you have the tourists. I think there's something that needs to be done in terms of managing tourism and keep it to the level that doesn't destroy the site, and also to maintain the original idea of UNESCO, education, culture. We want to admire this, we want to learn about it, we want to educate ourselves, and we want to share the experience with the local population, who are the guardians and who have the knowledge about the site and the intangible heritage. So we should use this moment that we have to rethink and to reconceptualize or start working on how we can maintain these values through tourism, and let not tourism overrun the sites. Make it very clear. Talking too long.
Tommy, do you want to say something?
We have a question, which I think is a nice bridge for our third question for Stefan, and also for what he has been mentioning. So I hope I pronounced this correctly. I apologize in advance. But Prachi Singla asks how the COVID affected the World Heritage sites, how this COVID crisis, not only in terms of tourism, but also in terms of the people who manage the sites and what it actually meant for them. And I think this links well to the fact that COVID has had unequal effects and unequal impacts, and the people that hold the knowledge of these World Heritage sites in most cases, which are indigenous people and local communities, they've been hugely more impacted than, for example, you and I. So with this in mind, how did COVID change the scenario? And is there anything under the UNESCO Convention to prevent this or to address these issues?
Yeah, the impacts are twofold, and you can see it on the example of Venice. Tourism was completely stopped in Venice, and after a week or two, you could see the fish coming in the canals. You could see the water clearer. So nature came back. There was a huge positive effect of not having this big cruise boats, not having the wastewaters and all that come with tourism. And on the other side, of course, on the economical side, it was a huge loss because Venice lives from tourism and only from tourism. And so this, I think, is the case for probably most of the sites, that they lost a lot of income, needed to maintain the sites, but in terms of conservation, the effect was probably positive. UNESCO has not addressed the issue of COVID-19 because there was no session. The session of the committee was scheduled for early July, as usual. And due to COVID-19, the session has been postponed and no new date has been set. And I'm not aware, it could be, but I'm not aware of what the agenda will be and whether COVID-19 is going to be an item on the agenda or if any decisions will be adopted on the session. And we don't know when the next session could take place. It could be November, but it could be totally postponed, could just be skipped, and then the next one will be next July. So this is open.
Yeah, thank you.
I also find myself in ambivalent feelings because from a, let's say, planetary view, the COVID-19 pandemic is positive because it has a positive effect on the natural world because so much less travel, so much less CO2, so much less of all the threats and the impacts on the natural world. So that's a positive thing. That unfortunately comes with the price of a lot of loss of human life.
Yeah, since you're mentioning human rights and also the case of Venice, can also tell us something about that. I'd like to know something about local communities and indigenous peoples concerning World Heritage sites and what are the issues concerning their relationship, let's say, with World Heritage labeling. And I know it's a very huge question, and I am also aware that it's like the common denominator of your career. So maybe you could tell us something or give us an example, of what their engagement also is to make World Heritage sites more like the nominations more fair and respectful of nature and people.
Okay. Now, of course, the members of UNESCO are national governments and only national governments. They have the right to submit nominations. So this is different from the later conventions where NGOs play a greater role. We are fighting to improve that situation. And of course, indigenous peoples are fighting to improve their rights in the context of the convention. A lot of changes, positive changes, have been made in the recent years, but the basic fact remains that those who take the decisions are the national governments. And when we have national governments who are not favorable to indigenous peoples, there's the options to do something for them are quite limited. That is the unfortunate fact. We had a case in 2017 in China, where China nominated a huge area in central Tibet, fantastic area from the point of natural values. And the fact was that this area has been inhabited by Tibetan nomads for centuries. And it was probably the Tibetan nomads who made sure that there was not so much poaching and that the wildlife was protected, which now enabled the site to become a World Heritage. And knowing Chinese policy towards Tibet and Tibetans and Tibetan culture, we realized that probably the Tibetan nomads would be evicted from the site. When you look into the management plan, you can read, not in very explicit language, but when you know Chinese policies, you know what it means when they say they will encourage the herders to leave the area. What means encourage in China? If the government encourages you to do something, you know what you have to do. So we protested. We connected with the International Campaign for Tibet. There was a demonstration outside the building when UNESCO discussed the site. Eventually, all the impact we could make was that the Chinese delegation read a letter, official letter, which became part of the documents, confirming that they would respect the will of the herders, whether they would want to leave the area or not. What that will mean in practice, we don't know. It's very difficult to have access to the area. But the problem we have behind it is that when a country nominates an area only for natural values, it is only the natural values which will be evaluated. And IUCN doesn't have a policy then to go out and check whether there are any people there. And the mission that was sent for the evaluation didn't have a mandate to talk to the locals. And they were invited by the Chinese. They must be invited. Without invitation, they cannot go. At a time of the year when the Tibetans were not in the area, you know, they have seasonal pastures. So certain times of the year they're here, certain times of the year they're there. When you know where they are, you can bring your delegation from IUCN to the place where they are not there. You can say, oh, people, do you see any Tibetans here? No one. Okay. So we do have a structural problem. We have in some parts still an ideological problem. There are still some people who insist that nature can be conserved only without people. This is changing. The majority opinion is now that we cannot protect nature without the local. This is something that we also support. And we support, of course, indigenous rights as human rights. And this is, I think, a very strong place of human rights that relates to indigenous people. The whole idea of relocating people or evicting people from certain areas. By the way, we have it in cultural sites. In our new report, we have a case in Hampi in India, where the local community lives right next to the archaeological site. And in this year in March, the government destroyed the village and removed the people. So it's not only natural sites, it's also cultural sites, and it's not only indigenous peoples, it's also the regular villagers who live near the site. And this clearly is a human rights issue. And I think we have to look at how the World Heritage Convention also connects with the other conventions.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to ask you because, yeah, the convention mentions human rights and biodiversity and climate change so often, but I was wondering how the conventions are made to cooperate somehow. If they are overlapping somehow, but there's no instrument, there's no tool to make them co-work, let's say. So yeah, I think that's maybe a great issue to discuss now, but yeah, I was just I think it's just important to say that there's this clash also at a juridical level, maybe at a practical also.
Yes, interestingly, there's very little cooperation between the World Heritage and the other conventions. There is, I think, about 2 years ago, a first meeting took place between World Heritage and the Convention on Biological Diversity, but otherwise very little, and I think no systematic cooperation with the Human Rights Convention, which is deplorable, and there should be also checks, of course, before a site is inscribed, whether human rights are respected. And so there, then we have conflicts between two positive objectives, like climate change. Hydroelectric dams are still considered to be sustainable or renewable energy production. So in terms of climate change, hydroelectric dams are considered to be something positive. Even in terms of the SDGs, countries can promote the hydroelectric dams as a contribution to mitigating climate change. Whereas on the World Heritage sites, they are highly destructive. We see a lot of examples, like Coukl and the Seguici Game Reserve and many other places where hydroelectric dams destroy habitats of wildlife. So it's something unwanted under the World Heritage Convention, and there is no policy to solve that problem.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I think the approach of conservation in general was the big problem was that we were working in silos. It's appalling also the disconnection between the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, in this case also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Human Rights Convention. So everybody works in different silos, and they don't often it's not seen the horizontal axis which crosses all of this convention, which could be a solution to all of these problems.
I think it has to do with the image of the World Heritage. I think most people, if you ask people in the street or even politicians, they don't know much about the fact that the World Heritage is based on international law. They think it's some kind of list that some politicians in Paris who have nothing else to do think about, and then some honorary table, essentially for nothing. Or maybe other people would think of this as a tourism label, but nothing really serious. I think the convention has to do a lot of work to change their image from really, well, we could have it or we couldn't, it doesn't really matter, to something to explain how serious this convention is. And of course, then also take very specific steps on how to cooperate, practical terms.
Looking at the questions that we got from the people watching us, I think you right now just touched on a very important point. So the political dimension, and we have Francisco Barila, which asked, what role does political influence play in the designation of a World Heritage Site? We've seen the case with indigenous people. At the beginning, there was a stricter conservationist approach, so only nature, no people. And then towards in the last years, I would say, this has changed also due to political impact. For example, the IPES assess of 2019 that said that indigenous people can guarantee a higher level of biodiversity preservation. And therefore, now everybody is trying to jump on the trend, let's say, and guarantee those rights to indigenous people. So what is the difference, if I know this might be a huge question, but of the political influence in defining a natural World Heritage Site and a cultural World Heritage Site?
Between the two, I'm not really aware. I think everybody talking in the private talk will agree that the decisions taken about inscribing a site on the list are overwhelmingly political. The cases become more and more, let's say, disgusting, where when the advisory bodies tell the committee, we cannot see an outstanding universal value in the site, which is the key criterion. It must have that outstanding universal value. When ICOMOS or IUCN tells them that we don't see that outstanding universal value, and still the committee inscribed the site in the list. Because some countries push for it, for their own geopolitical or other interests. Then what do you do? If the advisory bodies request the committee to inscribe a site on the World Heritage List in danger, as Lake Ohrid in Macedonia, for instance, and in consecutive sessions, the committee doesn't do it, in spite of overwhelming documentation, then it's simply becoming too political. And we have, concerning indigenous peoples, we have a few very positive cases recently in Australia and Canada, where indigenous communities have been actively involved in the nomination, actively involved in the management of the site. So there are some countries who have learned, who are taking positive steps, but other countries don't. The one way to go about this is, and I heard this from people inside UNESCO, publicity. We need to bring this out into the light of the public. We need to raise awareness in the media. UNESCO cannot do this. The World Heritage Center is the secretariat of the committee, meaning they have to implement their decisions. They are the secretariat of the state parties. They have to do what the state parties tell them. And they cannot go public about this negative development. And the director of the center, no matter what she would like to do, the moment she would say anything that would be critical of one of the countries, she would lose her job the next day, of course. So again, it comes back to civil society. It comes back to us to raise awareness, to go public, and to make the world aware of what we're losing, and to urge, to admonish the governments. Again, this is not the heritage of the governments. This is the heritage of the world, including all of us. And we can demand that they do the right thing. This is, I think, again, a very critical difference to the other protected areas. Because under the convention, we have a right to intervene in faraway countries. I, as a German, have a right to intervene in Brazil or in Cambodia or wherever. Whereas, you know, I, as a citizen, I can complain about what's happening here or there, but you know, the convention is something different. I have a right.
Yeah, I think an example of how politicized the inscriptions are is just to look at the race between Italy and China to have more sites on the list, and yeah, that tells us a lot, a lot about how political interest play.
Nobody talks about the end of the list.
Yeah.
Again, in the booklet, the original idea was to have, let's say, 100 or so sites in the World Heritage List. Now we have more than 1,000, and there is no end. And everybody agrees that there must be an end, otherwise, you know, there will be a banalization or devaluation of the list as a whole. Because sooner or later you will inscribe sites that don't have the OUV. It's already started. But nobody has the guts to bring this issue on the agenda because everyone wants more for tourism, you know, for national pride, for whatever. And everybody avoids the discussion. We have to put this on the agenda. We have to say, hey, let's start thinking about how we can find an end to the list. Nobody is doing this. It will take a lot of courage to do it. Because you will have everybody against, even Italians.
Well, now you're our first guest for this cycles of webinars, but this is a practice that we would like to keep on for the next guests and so on. So I'm going to ask you a rapid fire question. So what is, in your opinion, the one thing that our viewers can do to contribute to the mission, to the work of World Heritage Watch? Is there a report they can read? If you would be able to summarize one concrete action that we could all do after at the end of the call, what would it be?
Okay. One is, of course, look at the World Heritage site next to you and see what's happening and alert us, write reports, go public on when things go wrong. Because the governments don't do it, they hide it. So we need to bring this. Every day I receive social media to emails, more information about what's going on the sites. And this is something we cannot do from Berlin. We need this huge network. So that's the one thing. The second, I'm sorry to say, we need money. There is a minimum of things that we need to do, and we cannot continue simply without any money. So we need donations, and simply it's a fact of life. I hate to talk about it, but it's a fact of life. Without money, we cannot produce the reports, we cannot do the travel, we cannot organize this. You know, it simply takes a bit of money. And create your local group or local NGO. Also educate your local mayors, your journalists, your teachers, everyone in your community about why this World Heritage Site is so valuable, why it's on the list, and what does it mean to be on the list. That you don't keep it for yourself. you don't keep it for your country. You keep it for the whole world. And that also brings us all together. We share that responsibility. So that's also one of the aspects of how we create that world community around our common heritage.
Do we have any other questions, Tommy?
So far, no, but I guess it's important to restate it for the people that are watching us that, as Stefan suggested, go out and see what World Heritage site is near you and try to see if anything is wrong, and then contribute to the great work that World Heritage Watch has been doing. I just posted in the latest report, the 2020 report, so you can all have a read.
Yeah.
And so, Edie, if you wanna close this up.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Stefan, for your speech, for your answers. It was really, really interesting to hear you and to see how many issues there are to still to solve and to discuss about, and also how different levels are involved. So the locals, the government, the UNESCO, and how difficult it is to make them speak to each other. But yeah, I think your work is really illuminating, and I also suggest everyone to go and take a look at the website of World Heritage Watch, or read the report from this year, which has just come out over the last few days. And I would say we can also tell the others something about the next session we're having. Tommy, do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, definitely. So once again, Stefan, thank you very much. You've been our first guest, and I think it was a great first episode of these Coukl dialogues. So first and foremost, thank you to you.
Thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Talk to whoever was out there. Thank you all for listening. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a weekly date, let's put it that way. So next week, we're going to interview Rick Leemans, who is the head director of the Environmental System Analysis Group at Wageningen University. And we will talk about the linkages of climate change and biodiversity loss. So one of the questions that was asked today was, and that Stefan briefly touched upon, was on this interconservation website. So next week we will talk about that. And thank you, everybody. We will be putting the website of World Heritage Watch on the page of the event, as well as the recording of the video. So you can all have a look back and look what Stefan and World Heritage Watch are doing right now to preserve our common heritage. And on that note, I thank everybody and see you next Friday.
Bye. Thank you again.